call came on a Tuesday morning and I almost didn't pick up. I was standing in the parking lot of the Naval Base Commissary, holding a paper bag of groceries against my hip and trying to remember if I'd locked my car. My phone buzzed in my jacket pocket, a number I didn't recognize, area code 757. I figured it was spam. I almost let it go to voicemail. I don't know why I answered, maybe because it was the kind of morning where everything felt slightly off, like the air pressure had changed and my body knew something my brain didn't yet. "Is this Sylvia?" a man's voice said, careful, measured, the kind of voice that has delivered difficult news before and learned to slow down doing it. "Yes," I said. "My name is Donahue. I'm the estate attorney for your grandfather's trust. I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer." I set the grocery bag on the hood of a stranger's car. I'm not sure I even noticed I'd done it. "Did your aunt read the entire trust document? All of it?" My grandfather built things. That was the simplest way to put it. He wasn't flashy about it. He didn't drive expensive cars or wear a watch that cost more than a semester of college. He wore the same canvas jacket to the hardware store that he'd worn since the 90s, with a tear along the left pocket that my grandmother had sewn up 3 times. He built furniture in his garage on weekends. He built a reputation over 30 years as a civil engineer in Chesapeake, Virginia, the kind of man contractors called when the job needed to be done right the first time. He built a life that looked from the outside almost ordinary. What most people didn't know, what even I didn't fully understand until I was older, was how carefully he had also built his finances. His name was Clive Adua. He'd come to Virginia from Nigeria in 1971 with a partial scholarship, a single suitcase, and, as he told it, an uncomfortable amount of stubbornness. He worked 2 jobs through graduate school. He married my grandmother, a woman from Richmond named June, who taught 4th grade for 31 years and had a laugh that could fill a room. They bought a house in a neighborhood people were just beginning to move into. They stayed when others left. They paid it off in 12 years. They invested quietly, steadily, in index funds and real estate and things my grandfather read about in library books because he didn't trust anyone who got paid a commission to give advice. By the time I was old enough to understand money, the house in Chesapeake had tripled in value. There was a rental property in Norfolk. There was a modest portfolio. There was a trust, written carefully, that my grandfather had revised 3 times in 20 years as his circumstances changed. I knew about the trust in the same vague way I knew he had a doctor and a dentist. It existed. It was important. I didn't think about it often. I grew up spending summers at that house. My mother was his younger daughter. His older daughter, my aunt, lived 20 minutes away and had a habit of dropping by unannounced, which my grandfather tolerated with a patience I always found remarkable. The 2 sisters had a relationship I could best describe as managed distance. They were polite. They sent birthday cards. They sat at the same table at holidays and found safe topics. But there was something underneath that politeness that I'd felt even as a child, a low hum of something unresolved, and I'd learned not to ask about it. My grandfather and I were close in a different way. It's hard to explain without sounding like I'm making myself the center of a story that was really about him. But he paid attention to me in a specific way that I never took for granted. When I was 9 and told him I wanted to be an architect, he didn't say that's nice. He said, "Why?" And when I answered, he asked another question, and then another, until I'd talked myself into something I actually meant. He did that my whole life, asked questions instead of giving answers. When I was 22 and deciding whether to take a job offer in Seattle or stay closer to home, he didn't tell me what to do. He said, "The question isn't where. The question is what kind of person you want to have become by the time you're 40. I took the Seattle job. I've never regretted it. I was 28 when he died. It was February, a gray morning, and I found out through a text from my mother, which was not how I would have preferred to find out. But my mother handled grief by moving fast, filling space with logistics. And there wasn't a lot of room in those first hours for the kind of phone call that would have allowed me to cry. I flew back to Virginia. I helped with the arrangements. I stood at the service and listened to people describe my grandfather in ways that were true, but somehow still didn't quite reach him, the way eulogies often can't. Because the things that make a person irreplaceable are usually too small and too specific to survive being said out loud in a funeral home. He had a good death, if there is such a thing. He was 81. He hadn't been sick long. He'd known it was coming, which meant he'd had time to make sure everything was in order. What I didn't know then was how in order everything actually was. The house sat on a half-acre lot in the Great Bridge neighborhood, a white colonial with a wide front porch and a detached garage where my grandfather had kept his woodworking tools arranged with a precision that bordered on ceremony. The house was appraised at just under $2 million, which, in Chesapeake, Virginia, reflected both its size and the 30 years of improvements my grandfather had made to it. There were the rental properties, a duplex in Norfolk, and a single-family home in Suffolk. There was the investment portfolio. When you added it together, the estate was worth somewhere close to $4.3 million. I did not know this number until much later. What I knew in the days after the funeral was that my aunt had taken over. She was the older daughter, she lived nearby, she had an air of authority that she wore like a well-tailored coat, and she stepped into the role of executor in a way that felt, if not exactly natural, then at least practiced. She communicated in brief, business-like texts. She had a meeting with the attorney that my mother and I were not invited to, which struck me as strange, but which my mother waved off. She just wants to get things organized, my mother said. My aunt's husband was a man named Philip. I had never particularly warmed to Philip. He was the sort of man who turned every conversation toward an anecdote about himself and had opinions about things he hadn't studied. But he was not unkind, exactly, and I had spent years being cordial to him for my grandfather's sake. I was staying at the house, my grandfather's house, during the week after the funeral. I had planned to stay 2 weeks, help get things settled, help my mother navigate whatever needed navigating. I was sleeping in the bedroom I'd always used in summers growing up, the one with the window that looked out over the backyard and the old magnolia tree my grandfather had planted the year my mother was born. On day 4 after the funeral, my aunt came by in the afternoon while my mother was at a neighbor's house. She sat down at the kitchen table, which still had my grandfather's reading glasses on it. I hadn't been able to move them, and she set a folder in front of her and looked at me with an expression that was trying to be kind and not quite getting there. She said the trust had been reviewed. She said the house and the properties and the primary accounts were being transferred. She said she and Philip had been talking, and they felt it was important to consolidate the estate cleanly. I said I didn't understand what that meant. She said it meant that they would be taking over management of the estate assets. It meant the house would eventually be sold, or she hadn't decided yet. Perhaps they would use it. It meant the rental income would go into the estate accounts while everything was settled. I said, "What about my mother?" My aunt said my mother would receive what the trust specified. I said, "What does the trust specify?" She said the attorney would be in touch. I said, "Can I see the trust document?" She said that wasn't necessary, that it was all being handled, and she picked up her folder and left. I stood in my grandfather's kitchen for a long time after that, looking at his reading glasses on the table, and I had a feeling I didn't have a name for yet. Not anger, exactly. Not grief. Something colder. Something that made me want to call a lawyer. But I was 28. I didn't have a lawyer. I didn't know how any of this worked. I thought about calling my mother, but she was already stretched thin. I thought about calling my aunt back, but I didn't know what I would say that I could say calmly. So I didn't do anything that afternoon. I made myself a cup of coffee, sat at the table, and thought about what my grandfather would ask me right now if he could. He would ask, "What do you actually know, and what are you assuming?" What I actually knew, my aunt had said the trust had been reviewed and assets were being transferred to her. She had not shown me any document. She had not mentioned my mother's specific share. She had told me, essentially, nothing. What I was assuming, that she was telling the truth, that the trust said what she implied it said, that there was no other version of events. The next morning, I called the attorney's office myself. The office of Donahue & Associates was on the 3rd floor of a brick building downtown, the kind of building that had been a bank in a previous era and still had that solidity to it, that sense of things being kept carefully. I hadn't made an appointment. I just showed up, which I think surprised the receptionist, but she was gracious about it. The attorney, his name was Donahue, first name Lawrence, though he introduced himself as Larry, was a compact man in his 60s with reading glasses on a beaded chain and the unhurried manner of someone who charged by the hour and had learned that rushing was bad for business and worse for people. He had been my grandfather's attorney for 19 years. He asked me to sit down. He asked if my aunt had been in contact with me. I said she had. I said she had told me the estate was being transferred and that I'd found the conversation vague. He said, "I see." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that I have turned over in my mind many times since. "Sylvia, your grandfather was a very deliberate man. He revised his trust 3 times. The last revision was 14 months ago." He paused. "I want to ask you something directly. When your aunt spoke to you, did she characterize the specific provisions of the trust?" I said she had not. I said she had been general. He nodded slowly, the way people do when something confirms something they already suspected. He said, "I think it would be worth your while to read the document in its entirety." He slid a folder across the desk. It was thick. It had tabs. I read for 45 minutes while he answered emails at his desk. The trust was written in legal language, but it was clear enough. My grandfather had structured it as a revocable living trust, which had become irrevocable upon his death. He had named my aunt as the initial trustee. That part was straightforward. But the trust also contained a provision that my aunt had not mentioned to me. It was in Section 7, subsection 4. It wasn't buried or hidden. It was just the kind of dense paragraph that someone reading quickly might skip, or someone reading strategically might choose not to mention. The provision stated that the primary residential property, the house in Great Bridge, was designated as a legacy asset to be maintained in the family and not sold during the lifetime of any direct descendants in the grantor's first generation, unless unanimous consent was obtained. Management of the property, including rental or personal use, could be assumed by the trustee, my aunt, but only in a fiduciary capacity, with accounting provided annually to all trust beneficiaries. Beneficiaries, plural. Because Section 3 made clear that the trust had 2 equal beneficiaries, my aunt and my mother, 50-50. All assets, including the house, the rental properties, the investment accounts. My aunt was the trustee, which meant she managed the assets, but she did not own them, not exclusively, not anywhere close to exclusively. And there was one more provision, Section 9, a specific clause my grandfather had added in the final revision 14 months ago. It stated that in the event of any attempt by the trustee to misrepresent the trust provisions to any beneficiary or beneficiary's descendant, the trusteeship would pass automatically to a successor trustee named in the document. The successor trustee named in the document was me. I sat with that for a long moment. The office was quiet. A printer hummed somewhere. Outside the window, a city bus went past. I looked up at Larry Donahue. He said, "Your grandfather asked me to make sure you read the whole document if you ever came in." I said, "He knew I'd come in." He said you would. He said you were the one who asked questions. I want to be careful about how I tell what happened next, because it would be easy to tell it wrong. It would be easy to make it a story about victory, about my aunt getting what she deserved, about justice arriving with dramatic timing. And there were elements of all of that. But that's not quite the shape of what it actually felt like. What it actually felt like was exhausting. My mother didn't know. That was the first thing that hit me when I walked back out to my car. My mother had no idea that she was an equal beneficiary of the trust. No one had told her. She thought, as I had thought, that my aunt was managing the estate and that things were being handled. My mother trusted people to handle things because she'd learned through grief that letting go of the details was how you survived. I sat in the parking lot for a long time. I thought about what my grandfather had done. Not the trust provisions. I mean, the deliberateness of it. He had seen something coming. He had known his older daughter well enough to anticipate how she might handle this moment. And rather than writing her out of the trust, rather than punishing her in advance for something she hadn't done yet, he had simply built a safeguard, a quiet one, one that required someone to ask questions and read carefully. He'd built it for me. I called my mother that evening. I chose my words carefully. I told her I had gone to the attorney's office and read the trust document, and I wanted to walk her through what it said. I told her she was an equal beneficiary. I told her about the provision regarding the house. I told her about Section 9. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said he always did say read everything twice. We called the attorney together the next morning. He had already, by that point, sent a formal letter to my aunt notifying her of the misrepresentation and triggering the succession clause. He had done this, he said, because he had an obligation to the trust and to all beneficiaries, and because my grandfather's instructions had been explicit. My aunt called me that afternoon. I didn't answer. She left a voicemail. The voicemail was long and moved through several different emotional registers: surprised, then defensive, then apologetic, then defensive again. She said she hadn't meant to mislead anyone. She said it had all happened very fast. She said she hoped we could talk. I listened to the voicemail twice. I didn't call back that day. The next several months were not simple. I want to say that because I think stories like this, family stories, inheritance stories, tend to compress the hard parts. They skip from confrontation to resolution. But the middle part, the part where you are navigating an estate attorney and a family rift and your own grief simultaneously, while also trying to do your actual job 3 time zones away, that part was just work. Ordinary, grinding, unglamorous work. There were meetings. There were documents. There were moments when my aunt and I were in the same room, sitting across a conference table, being civil in the particular way that people are civil when they are trying to get through something rather than towards something. I became the trustee. It happened officially in early April, about 6 weeks after my grandfather died. I was 28 years old and suddenly responsible for a trust that included a paid-off house in Chesapeake, a duplex in Norfolk, a single family in Suffolk, and an investment portfolio that, once I'd had an accountant actually review it properly, turned out to be worth considerably more than I had understood. I did not know what I was doing at first. I hired a fee-only financial advisor, someone who didn't work on commission, because that's what my grandfather would have done. I read. I asked questions. I made a lot of phone calls. My aunt and my mother reached. Eventually, something that I think will take years to fully settle into. They talk. They are careful with each other. There are things that were said and things that were implied that don't disappear. But my mother went to my aunt's house for Thanksgiving. They sat at the same table and found safe topics. I think that's what they'll do for a while, and I think that might be okay. Philip has opinions about how the trust should be managed. He shares them with me occasionally in texts that I read and do not respond to. The house is still in the family. My mother uses it some weekends. I've been there twice since everything's settled, staying in my grandfather's old study, which still smells faintly of cedar and machine oil from the garage next door. His reading glasses are still on the kitchen table. I couldn't bring myself to move them. There's something I think about when I'm there, standing in that kitchen. My grandfather could have made it simple. He could have written the trust differently, could have named me directly, could have skipped the part where my aunt had the opportunity to do what she did. He had 19 years and 3 revisions to rearrange things however he wanted. He didn't. He left the structure the way it was, but he built the safeguard in. He gave my aunt the role, and then he quietly made sure that someone would ask the right questions if something went wrong. He assumed good faith first. He planned for the alternative second. I think about what kind of person builds a document that way. The patience it requires. The refusal to assume the worst before it happens. The belief, even at 81, that the right structure can hold things together better than any single decision made in advance. He left the house. He left the accounts. He left the accounts. He left the cedar smell in the study. But the thing I carry with me, the thing I think he actually intended to leave, is that habit of asking one more question. Reading one more page. Not because you expect to find something wrong, but because careful attention is the only way to really know what's in front of you. He said that to me once, not about estates or wills or legal documents. He said it about a blueprint I'd drawn in college that I was sure was right. He looked at it for a long time and then said, "Walk it again." Not because you made a mistake, because the second time, you'll see what the first time didn't. I walked it again. He was right. He usually was. I've thought a lot about why my grandfather built the trust the way he did. He had 19 years and 3 revisions to change it. He could have cut my aunt out entirely, could have named me trustee from the start and avoided all of it. He had every legal right to do that. He chose not to. That choice used to confuse me. It doesn't anymore. What my grandfather understood, and what I had to live through before I could understand it too, is that the way you structure things matters as much as what you decide. He didn't punish my aunt in advance. He gave her the role, assumed she would do the right thing, and then quietly built a safeguard for the moment she might not. That's not naivety. That's a particular kind of intelligence that I don't think gets talked about enough. It's the intelligence of someone who has watched enough human behavior to know that people reveal themselves under pressure and who plans accordingly without becoming cynical about it. My aunt made a choice in those first days after my grandfather died. She read part of a document and decided that was enough. She moved fast, spoke with authority, and counted on no one asking questions. What she didn't account for was that my grandfather had spent 28 years teaching me to ask exactly those questions. The consequence of her choice wasn't something anyone imposed on her. It was something she built herself. One vague conversation at a time. One unreturned phone call at a time. I don't think she's a bad person. I think she was scared and greedy in a moment when grief made both of those things feel more urgent than they were. Most of us have had a moment like that. The difference is what we do with it. What I took from all of this, and I mean actually took, not in a bumper sticker way, but in the way that changed how I move through the world, is that attention is the most underrated form of integrity. Not dramatic honesty, not grand gestures of principle, just the willingness to read one more page, ask one more question, and not assume that the version of events you were handed is the complete one. My grandfather didn't have a motto posted anywhere in his house. He wasn't the kind of man who put things on walls, but he had habits. The habit of reading contracts completely, the habit of asking why before accepting how, the habit of building things, whether furniture or finances or relationships, in ways that would hold up under stress. Those habits are what I inherited, not because he wrote them into a legal document, though in a way he did exactly that, but because he practiced them in front of me for 28 years, quietly, without ever making a lesson out of it. Sylvia got the trusteeship. My mother got her fair share. The house is still in the family, but what I actually carry with me, everywhere I go, is the habit of reading to the end.